Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's Long Institute Distinguished Lecture. I'm Emily Baum, Director of the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine, and I am just delighted to be able to introduce this year's distinguished speaker, Professor Guobin, who is going to be speaking with us today on the topic of social media and social history during the Wuhan lockdown. Professor Yang is one of those academics who has accomplished so much in his career that it is difficult to properly introduce him in the span of only a couple of minutes, but I'm going to try to do my best. Just to give you a sense of his many accomplishments, his most recent CV runs to 31 single-spaced pages. It is truly an intimidating document. Professor Yang is currently the Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communication and Sociology at the Annenberg School for Communication and the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also directs the Center on Digital Culture and Society and serves as Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. He has not one, but two PhDs, the first from Beijing Foreign Studies University and the second from NYU. Professor Yang is the author or editor of, by my count, 10 books, including most recently his fabulous new book, The Wuhan Lockdown, which was just published by Columbia University Press, and which is honestly just a smart, fast-paced, and just an extremely humanizing book about how ordinary people in Wuhan documented and came to terms with COVID-19 and the ensuing lockdown in this city. We will put the link to that book in the chat, and I really encourage you to check it out. Last but not least, before I turn the floor over to him, I also just wanted to say that I worked with Professor Yang as a young master's student, and he was one of the people who encouraged me to forge ahead with a PhD. So I am very grateful to him and really just so honored to be able to introduce him as this year's Long Institute Distinguished Speaker. So without any further ado, Professor Yang, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you for such a wonderful, warm introduction. And I would also like to thank the Long U.S.-China Institute for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm deeply honored, and thank you all for joining today's event. What a rotten time we are living in. Lockdowns, quarantines, pandemic, and now war. In times such as these, stories of the resilience and tenacity of ordinary people are one of the few sources of solace and strength. My selfish purpose in writing the Wuhan lockdown was that I found inspiration and strength from the stories of the citizens in Wuhan. As we all know, Wuhan was locked down on January 23rd, 2 years ago. That was the first city to be locked down due to the pandemic. After the lockdown started, there was an explosion of personal writing and storytelling on social media. Residents in Wuhan told stories about their lives under lockdown in many different forms, using many different media. They posted photographs, videos, video blogs, paintings, poems, and of course, lockdown diaries. All of these were posted on social media. And many were not posted, which we couldn't read or access. The output of these social media postings was remarkable in variety and size. One of the most extraordinary genres of these was lockdown diaries. Of course, diary writing is not new. People had written online diaries or blogs before the lockdown, but still, lockdown and pandemic diaries was a new online genre that thrived in this period. There are unparalleled sources for capturing the lived experiences and emotions of residents and their everyday lives. Authors in the past, historians or social scientists, rarely had the luxury of access to such personal records. In recent Chinese history, there were several national disasters. The Sichuan earthquakes in 2008 caused more than 87,000 deaths and tens of thousands of injuries. The SARS outbreak in 2003 caused over 300 deaths on the mainland and about 300 deaths in Hong Kong. These disasters devastated cities and towns and the lives of millions, but none of them left the wealth of personal and social records that we have seen emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. In the US and many other parts of the world, personal storytelling and documents of all varieties have also appeared in large numbers. But at least in their social impact, they did not reach the scale or the intensity of the personal storytelling during the Wuhan lockdown. There were pandemic diaries around the world, but few of them were as popular or influential as those written by Fang Fang or Guobin or Xiaoyin or many others. It is surprising in a sense, considering that the Chinese social media are censored and those in the US are more open. Chinese diary writers had to negotiate censorship on top of the hardships of the lockdown, but they still produced the most influential social media postings and personal stories. So what I wanted to do in the book was to tell their stories and to do so through their own voices as much as possible. The way I did this was I spent a lot of time reading and rereading these stories, and I followed them closely every day. I followed many diarists on Weibo, on WeChat. As I read, I took notes, and gradually a number of important themes emerged, which eventually became the chapter titles of the book. The book has 9 chapters in addition to a preface and a conclusion. The chapters cover the following themes: residents' initial reactions to the lockdown, China's media environment before 2020, citizen reactions to state mobilization of the war on COVID, citizens' own self-mobilization through personal writing, civic organizing, censorship, stories of medical professionals and patients, nationalism, and collective memory. As these themes suggest, the book is mainly about citizens' experiences and their acts of citizenship, and not about China's COVID policy per se. Where policy comes in is where I talk about residents' reactions to policies. Many of the stories I recount in the book are familiar to the Chinese public. Some have been covered by international media, such as the stories of Dr. Li Wenliang, Dr. Ai Fen, Fang Fang and her diary. So these are some of the better known stories, but the book also tells stories of characters not very well known to the public, and they include community volunteers, COVID patients, healthcare workers, and so on. So these individual stories are about personal resilience, perseverance, personal sacrifices to protect family and communities, as well as hardships, personal hardships, fears, love, friendship, tragedies, and protest. This sort of is a rough list of the keywords in the story of the Wuhan lockdown. So one question we might ask is, why were residents in Wuhan so engaged and passionate about telling their stories, despite all these hardships? Maybe probably because of these hardships. There are many reasons, and I'll just mention a few here. The first one is that many diarists emphasize the unprecedented nature of the Wuhan lockdown. They saw themselves very self-consciously as witnesses to history, and they were determined to leave personal records through diary writing. One diarist, who I call Mr. Amber, was a very self-conscious writer. He explained to himself repeatedly in multiple diary entries why he was keeping a diary. And he reminded himself again and again to persevere to the end of the lockdown. And remember, when people were writing these diaries, they didn't know when the lockdown was going to be lifted. So on January 28th, the 6th day of the lockdown, Mr. Amber wrote that his original intention in keeping a diary was to document his and his family's life so that more people could understand Wuhan and the lives of its people. So this is what he wrote, quote, "My diaries are running account, but the records are true. Therefore, in my heart, I feel that my lockdown diary is meaningful, maybe meaningful only to myself. One day, when I look back from my old age, she will be the grand historian's record of part of my life." He was referring to 史记. So his own diary to himself was like a grand historian's record. This self-awareness as witnesses to history implied a sense of social responsibility. I've just very recently, just the other day actually, I read a fantastic new article, a study of pandemic poetry in China by the Italian scholar Federico Piccioni. He emphasizes the long-standing cultural tradition of poets and the literati who saw it as their social responsibility to respond to issues of the day through their writing. I think this is true to some extent, at least to the diary writers in my book. For a feminist activist like Guobin, who I wrote about in some detail in the book, solving social problems begins with telling stories about the problems. She wrote her diary as a form of civic engagement. But initially, she felt that life was so upside down that keeping a diary, a daily journal of personal life might be too trivial. And she did not want to be seen as a miserable victim. And she didn't feel, and this is what she wrote, she didn't feel she was among the most unfortunate. But then she also realized that maybe because she did not want to admit that she was a victim, and that it took courage to recognize one's powerlessness. So one of her diaries, the title was A Sense of Powerlessness, and it became really, I think, one of the earliest, the most popular diary entries on social media. So, and then she considered the meaning of keeping a diary from an activist's perspective. And in her own words, she wrote, "As a gender equality advocate, I know better than others that to solve a problem, it's first necessary to tell it. I decided to try to keep a diary because I do need support now." So that's another reason why people were keeping diaries, as a kind of social responsibility and civic engagement. A final point I'd like to emphasize is some sort of historical continuity. Remarkable as it was, the explosion of personal writing during the lockdown was also not that surprising from a historical point of view. There are many historical precedents. the history of the internet in China has been a history of all forms of personal writing and multimodal storytelling. Dynamic and creative forms of online expression have always coexisted with censorship. The writers and bloggers on the internet are the grassroots intellectuals, which Professor Sebastian Weck writes about in his book, 民间. For earlier cases of the explosion of personal writing, we may even go all the way back to the beginning of the economic reform, the democracy war period, when numerous 民刊, so-called, or people's publications mushroomed around the country and on university campuses. But what was unique about the personal writing during the Wuhan lockdown was that it focused exclusively on this historical event. Residents self-consciously tried to document it as witnesses to history. So these postings and personal stories then sort of became the data for my book, although to call them data it can be misleading. The individual who wrote about their experiences during the lockdown, they were not only storytellers of a historical drama happening out there, right? They were the protagonists of that drama. So the historical significance of social media postings lies in their role as both documents of history and as history-making documents. And I will explain why, and I will give some examples. Social media scholars view the internet and social media as archives. There are some studies with this argument, social media, the internet itself is an archive because users leave so much information on them. We leave traces of just about everything we do on social media. And just about everything we do in our daily life now has something to do, right, with media. It's difficult to separate daily life from media. The Italian media philosopher Maurizio Ferrazzi argues that the cell phone is a writing machine more than a machine for speaking. Our phones hold an archive of photos, notes, grocery receipts, text messages, right? Many, many other things. We find all the details of our daily life recorded in our phones and other media we use. So the main purpose of the phone is for writing and recording. And I think what Ferrari says of the cell phone can be said of social media platforms in general, such as Twitter or Facebook or WeChat. But if we as users, social media users, produce so much personal records and archives on social media, we may like to think that we are the custodians of these records. But that's not entirely true. Social media platforms everywhere have their technological, commercial, and political logics. They are controlled by capital and regulated by the state. User behavior and personal information are turned into data for commercial and political purposes. As a result, users only, like us, really only have limited control over what we write or archive on social media. Their stories can easily go missing. Stories on social media can easily go missing for a variety of reasons, censorship, but also technological updates and other, changes. And in a way, algorithms probably have more control over their archives than we do, right? We know from last year's news, the whistleblower of Facebook, right, leaked that Facebook algorithms encourage hate speech for profit. So all these, sort of makes us realize that even though we leave a lot of traces on social media and like to think of ourselves as the custodians of these records, we really have limited control. In China, internet censorship may prevent users from saying or doing certain things online. Postings and personal user accounts may be deleted and disappear without notice. This creates a sense of ephemerality about the internet among netizens. But we all know it has not stopped netizens from sharing information online. In fact, over time, it has created a habit among savvy users to save and archive information of value to them. And that's a habit I have developed, and I know other colleagues have also been doing that. It actually will be a fascinating project to talk to China's internet users and find out what kind of contents of the web they habitually archive, on their own desktops over the years. Well, I think that will be a very fascinating kind of folk history, social history of China's internet culture. Anyway, because social media are peculiar forms of archives, with all these factors beyond the control of users themselves, working with these archives or producing content on these archives, often, especially trying to get information out of it and preserve them, it's like valiant efforts to try to rescue history from social media. And a number of diarists in my book wrote in great detail about their own experiences with internet censorship and how they overcame difficulties in order to continue posting their diaries. So let me share a couple of stories from the book. This is in the chapter about censorship on page 146. I'll just read these few paragraphs. Let's see. Diarists cultivated strategies for coping with censorship. Patience and persistence were essential. For Mr. Yun, one must be bold and careful when operating a WeChat public account. To be bold means to be brave in voicing one's views publicly. To be careful is to express oneself with caution. This may sound contradictory, but that's what life is often like. It's full of contradictions and messiness. Think over in your own mind, he wrote, what can be said and what cannot be said. How can one be bold? And so this is what he captured, Mr. Yun captured in his own words about what kind of strategies to use. Xiaoyin was another diarist, was one of the most critical diarists, and he coped with censorship very carefully. On March the 2nd, 2020, he told readers that it took him an hour and a half to publish his entry for that day. Just one daily entry. But remember, many of these diarists were publishing their entries every day for 76 days in total. And this particular entry took him an hour and a half to publish. It simply would not go through despite his repeated attempts to post it. He checked his use of words meticulously. In the end, it went through after he changed one word in the following passage. So the whole story, he wrote about it in his diary. So this is the passage, quote, even when the epidemic situation is so grave, we still see that some people are lax and lazy in doing their job. There are always people who depend on the operations of the monster machine and benefit from the dividend of the rules. The same danger has another manifestation. To make sure that they don't get into trouble, some people would rather move farther to the left of the ideological spectrum. You never get into trouble for seeing praise, end quote. So because of one word in this paragraph, it took him an hour and a half just to get this posted. And he figured out eventually which word was the cause of the problem. And he revealed the secret the next day, in his entry the next day. The original text that had prevented his diary from being published was the word left, being farther to the left, 左一点. He was able to publish the entry after he changed left to radical. He changed 左一点, leftist, right, to 激进, radical. He was able to publish after this change. It's not exactly clear to him, he wasn't clear why left was a more sensitive word than radical. So, this just shows the kind of unpredictable aspects about trying to post your diary entries. But people persisted. Xiaoyin persisted. Others persisted. Fang Fang's diary was posted by someone who runs a WeChat public account, and this person is called Xiang. And here, very briefly, is her story. When Xiang started publishing Fang's diaries, she used a WeChat public account she had named Xiang's seventh dimensional space. But that account was repeatedly closed, and she was forced to open new accounts and move from one to another like a guerrilla publisher. After a seventh dimensional space was closed, she opened the WeChat accounts, 8th dimensional space, 9th dimensional space, 10th dimensional space, and finally 11th dimensional space. And she wrote, this is what she wrote. The articles were deleted one after another. The 7th dimensional space was shut down twice. The 9th dimensional space was taken back by the platform. The 10th dimensional space does not allow user comments. Once an article was deleted just 1 hour after it was posted, I had a deep sense of powerlessness. The machine confronting me was gigantic, and I was just like a tiny ant. After that article was deleted, Fang said, "Do we still want to publish?" I said, "Yes, I'm a stubborn person." I remember most deeply that the article entitled "Wrong, Wrong, Wrong" failed to go through after even more than 10 attempts to post it. Eventually, I had to post a notice to say, I've tried my best. But soon, readers began to post chunks of Fang's diary in the comments section, one after another like a relay, until the entire diary was posted. So there was a lot of documentation of every aspect of life during this period, of course, but I just since I wanted to talk a little bit about social media today, I wanted to focus on people's experiences with censorship. These are a few examples. But as I said, these acts of documentation were not merely documenting something. They were also historical acts themselves. They were acts of citizenship with real social impact. The posting of a diary on a social media platform, where it could be easily disappeared, or itself really just posting it where it could be disappeared easily, was itself an assertion to existence. So in this sense, the documentation of history was part of the history-making process. And it's really difficult to separate the two, that these are pure historical records of a history that happened. They are also historical, they're also part of that history, right? So I'd like to give a few more examples, from different chapters in the book. One is about the diarists. Diarists wrote about resilience and endurance during the lockdown, not just about censorship, but other aspects of life. They documented their personal experiences. This is kind of documentation of experiences, but the writing of diary, as I mentioned earlier on, was itself an act of endurance. This diary writing, even in ordinary times, requires a lot of self-discipline and perseverance. You have to write it every day. A pandemic intensified the hardship of writing and keeping up. Wuhan diarists had to overcome the obstacles of time management, boredom, mental and physical exhaustion, not to say censorship. So writing diaries during the lockdown was an ordeal and an accomplishment. And when these diaries were shared on social media, as they were, right? They were, for some people at least, they became examples for emulation. People were just, enduring the hardships of lockdown, and they became moral examples for the public. Tao Tao, another diarist in the book, was a mother of a 12-year-old son. She wrote for the entire period of the lockdown and posted 76 diary entries. On February 26th, she wrote about her effort to practice self-discipline by paying her respects to the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. And this is what she wrote. It's a long entry, actually. I just quote one passage. For 20 years, Haruki Murakami persevered, getting up at 5 in the morning to start writing. For him, daily writing was like going to work. He would write for 4 to 5 hours. Nothing could stop him. He would run at least 10 kilometers every day. Every year, he would run at least 1 marathon. A person who can spend decades in exactly the same way, like one day, and do things every day in a carefully regimented way, deserves a lot of respect. I have a special liking towards such people. A week after lockdown, I began to pay respect to this kind of disciplined life. I no longer spend all my time eating, sleeping, and watching TV dramas. This was what Tao Tao wrote. My second story is from a COVID patient, and her name is Bu. It's from her video diaries of vlogs, video blogs, which were posted on Xiaohongshu, one of the videos live streaming platforms. It's called Red in English. So I'm going to read, it's a long story, but I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from the book on page 100. Bu, mother of a 3-year-old daughter, was also hospitalized in the Wuhan Lang, which was one of the temporary shelter hospitals. She posted her first COVID vlog on January 27, 2020, on the social media platform Red. Abu's first vlog was a recording she made from home. As the camera moved left and right, taking in the high-rise buildings outside, loud voices shouting "Wuhan 加油" came from the background. "Wuhan 加油" is a common way of saying cheers and offering encouragement. Some of the screams coming from the background of the video were hoarse and sharp, striking a note of sadness and distress. Several blocks later, on February 7th, Abu filmed herself. Speaking to her phone camera, she reported that she had been diagnosed with COVID and was at a designated spot waiting to be picked up and taken to a shelter hospital. Wearing a down coat, she cut a solitary figure in the wintry cold. The following day, She reported that by the time she was admitted into the hospital, it was 2 a.m. She was starving and ate a very late dinner. February the 8th was the Lantern Festival, and she was happy that patients were given as part of their meals the traditional festival food, yuan xiao. However, she wrote in the space beneath the video that the hospital facilities were poor. The mobile bathrooms were big enough for several hundred people, but dirty. Quote, this is what she wrote. Maybe it is because there are not enough supporting staff, but we have to deal with it. The war has begun. The only way is to go forward and protect the most important people dearest to your heart. And then the next paragraph, let me skip a little and then move to the next paragraph. Abu's vlog on February 10th made her famous. It was a video of a group dance inside the hospital. A song was playing in the background. Leading the dance was a female medical professional in full PPE with a face mask and protective eyeglasses. Although the PPE made her look bulgy, her dance moves were spirited and graceful, prompting a viewer to comment jokingly that she must be an undercover professional dancer among the medical professionals. As Abu's camera moved left and right, it showed some patients dancing along while others held up their phones to record or photograph the dancers. In the comment section of the video posting, a viewer asked for the name of the song. Abu responded that it was a Mongolian song called Fire Red Sa Ri Lang. 火红的夏日朗. The video had more than 200,000 views and close to 2,000 comments when I checked on it on June 19th, 2020. Many viewers commented that they were moved to tears to see such cheerful dancing in the hospital. Some observed that it was a really tough job for the medical workers who not only provided medical service, but also helped create an uplifting atmosphere. One person wrote that a granny who was dancing with her hands up in the air reminded her of her own grandmother. Another called on viewers to help medical workers fight the virus by staying home. Quote, I've tried hard to control my emotions since the virus started. This afternoon, when I saw this video, I couldn't hold my tears any longer. We are all ordinary people. Life is not easy for any of us. Let's do our own share, try not to leave home and protect ourselves. So, a lot of stories like this, individual stories like this, some are in video forms, others are in texts. The proliferation of all these kind of stories and voices, I think had a very important but unintended social effect. It built a sense of national solidarity in a way that Twitter or Facebook did not. Social media in the US were already polarized before the pandemic. They're not getting any better during the pandemic. Chinese social media had some degree of polarization, and it persisted during the pandemic and even intensified due to the conflict over Fang Star, which I don't think I have time to go into. But in general, all these voices, proliferation of online voices helped to produce a strong sense of togetherness during the Wuhan lockdown. I think the sharing of these stories had a lot to do, this is the history-making part of the story. They're not just records of history, but made history in the sense that they produced powerful emotional effects. These personal stories expressed personal emotions, but also helped others to release their own feelings. So in that sense, they produced a kind of collective catharsis. I think I was going to talk a little bit about the last chapter, which is about mourning and memory, collective memory. But I see that my time is running out. So let me see, just a few things. The last chapter, it really is, I wanted to talk about the question of collective memory from, mainly focusing on the story of Dr. Li Wenliang. We all know that Dr. Li died on February the 7th. But on his WeChat, Weibo account, he posted his last message on February the 1st, when he announced that he had tested positive for COVID. So, but after he died, his last message on Weibo basically became a wailing wall for tens of thousands of netizens. They keep visiting his Weibo and leaving comments there. All the way until now, people are still doing that. And they talk about all sorts of things. I was going to read a little bit of a few original comments, but I'm going to skip it considering the time limit, because I want to get some questions and have some discussions. So let me just conclude by saying that I try to give you a sense of the kind of stories that I try to tell, and the role of social media as in the documentation of this history and in the making of this history. I've been asked by others, what do all the stories add up to? I try not to impose my own views here. I'd rather readers draw their own conclusions. I thought of this as a form of narrative openness or uncertainty. Literary scholars are concerned with the question of narrative openness because it reflects the value they attach to the multiplicity of meaning in literary texts. Does narrative openness have any use for a book like the Wuhan lockdown? I'd hope so. I think many problems in this world, this rotten world, as I mentioned at the beginning, result from moral certitude of one kind or another that does not tolerate ambiguity or contradiction or difference or uncertainty. Perhaps the complexity of the Wuhan lockdown as a historical event warrants some degree of narrative openness, especially since the event was still unfolding when I was writing the book. And it is very close to us still, with no clear endpoint. So I hope at least this means that, that my book is an invitation to more accounts and more stories, more books about the history of the Wuhan lockdown and the people there. Thank you very much. I look forward to some questions and discussions.